So take it away, Philipp.
Hi everyone. I'm Philipp. In case it's not my fault, you here. So and I was just talking sort of like talking about final fault semantics and theory, but I gather just have a bit of fun with points. This might be a bit more apt for the group here. Like the last time I gave this talk, it was more to like the general audience, computer scientists, but I mean type theory. So let's have a bit of fun. This is work, live work mostly, together with my supervisor, Nicola. And yeah, so what this is about. We're like doing this with like computer science thing, where like you use category theory to like describe certain things abstractly, and one of the subtasks that comes up is wanting to find final Coalgebras, whatever that is, for a certain class of functors. But since we're good type theorists, I don't want to do that constructively. At least that is what I think. And the interesting thing is that this is a slightly like rather general class of functors, and they're sort of like defined using quotients of some sorts. Pick your favorite category and think what that would mean. If you pick set, well, you kind of know what it means. But homotopy type theory and unigradient foundations, they have sort of like nice, more constructive quotients, and quotients in a way that you don't end up in setoid hell. So we thought, well, we try that. Let's see whether we can like prove something like this. And when I say something like this, I guess I'll get to the point. And yeah, so like, can we do that? And we here will focus on like the bad functor, or sometimes a multi-set functor. That's a particular instance of analytic functors, or one particular analytic functor. And I do think that the general case shouldn't be like too hard after this, but let's see. Talk to me again in a year. And we have some like, funny answers. So if we use classical definitions, and I'll tell you what these are later, but we can actually do this. That was a bit of a bummer. But you can do it for interesting things, sort of like finding these final Coalgebras. And if you use slightly more general definitions, you can do it. And this is where the fun with through points comes in. But you can relate the two definitions so that, like, I mean, I claim to have a more general definition, so that are related to the super thing and like tell you why this is actually something that's useful. And there's code here to like back up some of these claims if you want to see some ACTA code. And I can post a link later so that. Great. So yeah, I mean, last time I gave this was like, well, how do I motivate this? Well, and then there was a bunch of computer scientists who was like, well, we want to study the behavior of dynamical systems. And, well, I can spend a lot of time trying to do that here, but I guess let's just get to the bits of things. Since you're type theorists mostly, you can see how co-inductive types can be encoded using terminal Coalgebras of an endofunctor. And the idea here is to pick any sort of endofunctor f, and that gives you some sort of signature. So like how many constructors you have in your data type, and what the arity of the constructor is, and well, I guess it's all a bit untyped right now, but sort of like you can think of sort of like just some endofunctors giving you a description how to build a signature. And then you can look at functions that go from, well, variables into like your constructors, sort of like co-structures over the signature, and if you find a fixed point for this functor, then it gives you a co-induction principle, and if you find, well, in this case, the largest fixed point, this is sometimes how the like computational behavior of your co-inductive data types is justified. Yeah, so this is roughly what we're going to do. If you're confused now, please raise your hand. If not, don't. But in any other case, just like interrupt me if there's any sort of like misunderstandings or typos. Great. So here's an example. So for example, pick any set A, and then we find this functor that is 1 plus A times X, so what this is, so that like the set over here, let's think it sets, is, well, either it's maybe A and X, essentially. So if you think of this as a signature, this is sort of like, this gives us a data type, or describe a data type that has two constructors, and one of the constructors is sort of like a constant, and the other one is sort of like some a argument and then some x, and you can think of the x here as sort of like a placeholder, where you can put this in, and if you take the smallest fixed point of this sort of thing, you can find the initial algebra, and this gives you the list. A list as a data type, so the thing here on the left is the nil constructor, and the other one is the cons constructor. And if you find, if you look at the greatest fixed point of this functor, then you can see this is essentially strings of things in A. They are potentially infinite. They might be finite, like it still sort of like includes lists, but you might also have potentially infinite streams of things in A.
These are usually called co-lists. Streams should be only the infinite part.
Oh, right, yeah, of course, yeah. Okay, yeah. I was contemplating whether to just call it co-list, and I was like, well, that's a bit lame because they're just putting co in front of everything, but yeah, you are probably right. Yes. So, yeah, so these are streams and lists are co-lists. And the co-induction principle, this is sort of like this map that underlies this equivalence I showed you earlier, just gives you some sort of way of unfolding this co-list. So you're taking one step, going from a stream or co-list to, well, either it's like over, or there's one more element, one head element, and the rest. Question here, if we want to follow this recipe of building data types using functors and stuff, we can do inductive data types with extra equations and we get higher amount of types, like roughly. And the question is, if you have co-inductive types and the equations like, what the hell are these? Like co-inductive hits.
Co-hits.
Co-hits. Yeah. So this is funny paper by, I think, Andrea Besossi is involved in that. They have a paper on this and they just title it Greatest Hits, which I find is amazing. Because these are greatest base points. Yeah. Let's see. Let's do a bit of a case study on the multiset functor. So what are multisets? Well, these are just what we call collection of things where occurrences matter, like how often we have a thing. So if you look at my breakfast today, I had some pastry and coffee. Well, that's the same as having coffee and pastry, so it's just a collection of things, but I certainly didn't have 2 coffees. Well, maybe I did have, but the important part is that these are different multisets. So how many coffees I had this morning is important for a multiset in every members. So if you want to write this down in a bit more formal way, you could say, well, a multiset is some sort of size k, and a tuple of things. And right now this is just a list. And then we have some relation that tells us how to identify a certain or distinct multisets. And just say that, well, x's and y's are related or the same as multisets. They exist some permutation of the elements. So you can shuffle the elements around. And you can do that as a higher effective type in like homotopy type theory in AGDA. This is almost the AGDA code for it. So we say the data type of finite multisets over some base type is, well, a sigma type of some size k, and then vectors in x of length k modulo some relation, and then we encode the relation from the slide prior as this sort of like, well, there exists some equivalence of thing k such that, well, they permute the indices. And anticipating a question here.
It's not an accessory segment.
Yeah, exactly. The thing is, it doesn't actually matter what it is. So because another important part here, we have this sort of like quotient in here, and this is a set quotient. So if you've done a bit of homotopy type theory, you can like take different quotients, but they exist at a certain like level. They sort of like truncate some information at some point. And this is a crucial part because without this, the entire type wouldn't be a set in the sense of homotopy type theory. which would be a bit confusing because like why call it a finite multiset then if it's not a set? And in particular here, set in the sense means that if you have any two proofs of two multisets being the same, then these are the same proof. Yes, I guess. Yes. Yeah.
It says two, so are you making FM set a group point or a set?
Well, yeah. So this uses the cubical library indexing.
Are you normal or do you count from -2?
Well, I don't count from -2 is what I want to say. So this is a set quotient. I think you have to like subtract 2 if you want to go for the HoTT indexing. Because in hot style this would be a 2 group point, I guess, quotient. And I'm certainly not doing that. You look confused. Does that?
For a moment I was thinking this was, yeah, it's fine.
Okay.
No,
Yeah,
because,
that's
because it's a type of multisets, so
Oh, right. Okay.
so
Yeah.
that's why I'm confused.
Yeah. It will. Yeah.
It's kind of subsets.
Sorry?
It's subsets or something.
Yeah.
So yeah, and we look at this thing, and we want to sort of like think of this as sort of like a signature for some data type. And if you do this, you can think of this as sort of like a signature where you have for each arity a constructor, and then in the constructors, like they are also like k-array, but the order of the arguments doesn't matter. So what you get by finding sort of like the fixed points of the functors, you get finally branching under unlike trees. So you think of it as just like iterating this thing over and over, which is, I guess, the Knaster-Tarski construction for doing things. For lists, this would be finally branching unlabeled trees, but here we like throw the unorderedness in, like it doesn't matter in which order you take the branches. And if you look at the largest fixed point, it's classically what people tell you that this is sort of like the same thing, but like potentially non-well-founded trees that go on like forever, and you might never reach the bottom. For example, there's one tree in here that you can build as a set, which is like it just descends down, branching one everywhere, but never stops. Well, I mean, textbooks tell you that you can find these final algebras, but how do you actually do it? So here's a bit of category theory, like how people tend to do this, is they will look at sort of like what they call a final omega pocket chain. Well, essentially, what they look at is you take your unit object with the unit type, and you always have a map into it. And in particular, I have a map into it from like apply your functor to that unit object. So that's just the unique map into a unit. And since this is a functor, you can define a map. So you can like lift your thing on up. So this is the F map in Haskell, I would say, and then you sort of like can take this one step upward, like you go down from F squared to F of F1 to F of 1, and so on and so on and so on for, well, as long as you want. And the idea is that this sort of like limit of this chain, if it exists in some categorical sense, is a candidate for looking, like when we're looking for this type of. It might not work out, but at least it's a candidate. And the idea is that you always have some sort of canonical map that goes out and applying the functor to the limit to the limit of a chain is like shifted by 1. I think we had something like this yesterday, like, and this always exists. So like as long as you can like write down the type of limits, you can always sort of like write down this map. And then there's sort of like 1/2 of Adamek's theorem, I would say, that says in category theory that if this map is an isomorphism, then the functor has a fixed point, and the limit is the fixed point. And the proof of that isn't terribly difficult. It's just, well, you say this thing is a fixed point, and then for abstract nonsense reasons, you get an isomorphism over here, and then the fixed point you're looking for is just the composition of the two. Where this is just your assumption, and this is just a bit of, it's literally a 4-line proof, not that. So, kind of it is. And the idea would be to say, well, this works for kind of a lot of things, classically at least. So when people say they talk about analytic functors, and in particular multi-set functor, they think of sort of things that look like this, where you have a sigma, where there's like some type A here, and then a family array, and sort of you replace here the natural numbers and here the fin case. But sort of this is sort of the general signature of a analytic functor, and these are due to Joram, I guess, in the 80s when he was doing invertive combinatorics. And there's sort of like classical theorems that just tell you if, like, in set priorities, if this thing, if your function looks like this, then the map that you just constructed is definable. But this rests on a lot of assumptions, and in particular, sort of this like classically, so there's a lot of choice involved here. And it's not immediately obvious where, so we kind of like wanted to look at that. And the problem is that it actually doesn't work with the multi-set functor as we find it. So for a long time, it's just like trying to reconstruct the proofs that people were doing. And at one point, Nicola told me, hey, can you like just do this one lemma and like prove it? And just quickly doing it a week later, it's like, no, that doesn't work, at least not constructively. Because we can prove that this preservation method we had earlier is a split epimorphism, sort of like a nice surjection in some sense. But you can't prove that it's injective without sort of like assuming some other principles. So we want to prove that it's an isomorphism, and since we're working in univariate foundations, like in proving equivalence of isomorphism, or having bi-inverse is kind of the same thing. So we were able to prove that if this map is injective, then we get the lesser limited principle of omniscience, and the other way around. And what does this principle say? It says that if you have a stream of bits, and you know that the stream of bits is at most true, is true at most once. You don't know where it's true. It's just like someone tells you, hey, this thing like this, it's true at most once. Then you can decide that all of the odd positions in the stream are false, or all of the even positions in the stream are false. And like classically, this is like completely obvious. It's like, well, if it's at most at one position true, then it's either true nowhere, and then, well, this is kind of trivial, or it's true somewhere, and I know where that happens, and I can just like take sort of like the things in the neighboring positions, and then they have to be odd, and the rest is then trivial. But like constructively, that doesn't work. Like try writing the ACTA code for it, and you just no. Yes.
So I'm getting a bit confused. So the multi-set definition you've got is just a list, right? It's if fin n to x arrow. Sorry, fin n arrow x is just a vector, and but it's a sigma of a pair of the length with a vector. So that's just a list, right? And then you've got an equivalence relation is just saying that you don't care about the order,
Yes.
right? But the quotient is forgetting the order. So even though your omniscience principle is about streams, which are infinite, but then this is a finite thing. But the problem is you've promised to never look at the order. So then is that the problem? You can't then decide your property anymore. Is that right?
Kind of, yes. That is what is the problem, because so the identifications in the multisets and permutation, we kind of forgot those when we were quotienting, because we promised that this is sort of like irrelevant data when taking the set quotient, because like it is enough for us to conclude that two multisets are the same by providing that there's some permutation identifying those, but we don't get back which permutation it is that did the thing, and this is sort of like what gets in the way here, and so this is like, yeah, it's kind of the crux. Like you define this data type, and in order to like motivate the fact that it's got to be like finite multisets or sets, you take set quotients, but then you forget a lot of data that you kind of want to remember, and so that doesn't work. So at least the limit exists in that sense. And well, yeah. Yeah, don't do that if you want your things to actually work out constructively. You can't just forget about data. So apparently the code is that there's permutations into prop, and this is kind of what we're doing, but that's not really what you want to do, because the permutations are data, they're not the property. So enough for fun. How do we fix this? We define a type of bags that keeps the permutations around, at the trade-off that we end up with a group void at h level 3 or 1, depending on what world you're in. And we're going to do that by recalling the finite set list. The finite set is sometimes called Bishop finite. There's sort of like an underlying type, and these have a size, and then we have a proof that they're merely equivalent to some chosen thin k. And here this bar thing is a truncation that just normative type theory says, well, there is an equivalence, but you're not allowed to look at it.
So this is a bit weaker than the quotienting one, where so you've still got some trace of it around. Is that
Yeah,
right?
kind of. So this is the first like finite sets, we will use these. This is like not the definition yet. But importantly, it doesn't really matter whether you truncate the size or not. You can always get it back out because it's an invariant. So it looks a bit weird because like it feels like there's some data lying around that's still relevant, but that doesn't matter too much. And we can define sort of like a version 1 of our bags, which are called toads, that kind of look the same. So there's some sort of like shape here, but instead of being given by just a natural number, as it was the first time, right, it was given by the entire finite set. And then there's just like vectors essentially over this finite set as sort of like the members of the finite set. But by the magic of, well, commutative type theory, this thing has the correct identity type already. So if you want to say that x's and y's are the same as toads, then this is equivalent to actually giving an equivalence between the shapes and the proof that this triangle commutes. So since the identity type of the finite sets is given by these equivalences, this is kind of like what we get, and we don't have to quotient it, like we just get the correct way of identifying things for free at the cost of actually carrying these identifications around, like they're not irrelevant anymore. Does that make sense? Because some people know it, that's fine. And why toads? Well, this thing is kind of like large because we are like quantifying over types in our construction of finite sets. This goes from like at least the base universe into the next universe, or if you make a universe polymorphic, it's like it still goes up 1 in size. So these toads are kind of well large bags. But we can make them small by just essentially replacing thin sets are indexed by something that is small. Because the only thing in the definition that is sort of like causing the size issues is the thin set here. Because this lives in, well, at least universe 1. And this is a higher inductive type, and because I'm bad with like putting AGA on slides, I just put the inference rules here. And you can sort of like find a sort of like small axiomatization of thin sets by just defining a data type that has a constructor sort of like 1 for natural numbers. So there's 1 term for each natural number, and then you include sort of equalities for each permutation of associated like thin ends and thin ends. And if you're wondering why I allow sort of like the end and end here, like because you think like if this is 2 and this is 3, it's never going to be an equivalence between the two. It turns out it makes things easier in practice. So you never like you could have indexed this by sort of like only 1 natural number and just look at the automorphisms of thin end. It turns out in practice it is easier to like just keep the useless junk around. And then you have a bunch of coherences so that like if you have the path that corresponds to the identity, the equivalence, then this is the same as REFL. And if you have the composition of equivalence, then it's the same as the path composition of the associated equivalences, and then you have some truncation here that just say, well, this thing is a group point. Yes?
Isn't it already? Isn't it already a group point?
You define it as a higher vector type, so you have to question it. You have to truncate it. I'm pretty sure. I mean, you're invited to try and prove that it is a group.
Okay, so
It's sort of like it's freely generated, so there will be a lot of more paths. So you have to. Yeah.
All the paths that you're left with are going to correspond to one of the. It's definitely going to be the right pain to prove that it's a groupoid, because then you can't use, like you can't map into the type of groupoid, the type of set. You can't map into the type of sets to make like the code for equality, not directly at least.
Yeah.
But it should be doable. Give me a second.
Is it like almost the same as sigma over uncertain plane spaces? And I mean, when we construct it for uncertain plane spaces.
Yes. I talked to Martin, who isn't here right now, but I think he said essentially the same thing. We just haven't looked at the other like McLean spaces and like thought too much, but yeah, probably it is. And also I was
It's also
informed.
the rest completion of the category of finite sets.
Yes, yeah.
Sorry, the skeleton.
Yeah. And also this thing is super fluid, I was informed. Like actually you can just prove that this follows from the other axioms, but well, I mean here it is. I found that out 3 days ago and Martin told me that. Yeah, actually this is not me. But well, good to know. But the idea is that this is just sort of like a technical vehicle to get the thing into the correct universe, and you just replace your thing set here by the sort of like small axiomatization, and everything sort of like stays in the like correct universe, and you can prove that the two types are actually equivalent for any sort of like X you put in. So all is good. And so this is our bag that we end up with that looks deceptively simple, but sort of like packs all of the right information. And we can relate it back to the first definition we had. And in particular, if we set truncate this groupoid, get back the type of finite multisets. Where like here, the truncation then really just does that. It forgets about the extra identifications and just end up with the thing that we started out with. So this is sort of like some generalization, and I think it's a nice one to work with because it also does the thing we wanted to do, because we can show that this limit exists, remember that we talked earlier about, and that this preservation map is an equivalence for isomorphism. I think I proved that it's an isomorphism directly, but you get the equivalence from that. And so we can prove by a bit of abstract nonsense and by using other people's papers that this thing gives you a final Coalgebra. And the way this works is kind of neat, because there's this nice paper by Ernst, where they say that sort of like all polynomial functors from type to type preserve these chains, regardless of arrangement. So everything that looks kind of like a sigma type that I showed you earlier, like just does the thing. And the only thing that I had to do was to like take a hammer to my original data type and like make it into one of the sigma types. And once I have that, I just kind of get that result for free. I mean, it's still a bit of work because I actually want to formalize it, so you still have to understand the proof. But it's pretty cool that by just going away from this idea that like the only thing you can do is you can index by natural numbers and then you can make a quotient, and sort of like go to slightly more general concept that just says, well, we keep all of the necessary identifications in some sort of indexing set around. You can do these sort of things. So now this looks like a potential candidate for some sort of like a well-founded tree, sort of like internal in language of homotopy type theory, or in particular cubic language. So yeah. One last question. Can we cheat and can we get back a final Coalgebra of that M set? Because like, I mean, where is it? We related it back to the thing. So you could think that maybe, like, since these are sort of like the same thing, instead of working with this, we could like cheat and work with this and get back sort of like the final Coalgebra in sets. But it turns out, not really. Because yes, you get a fixed point, that is sort of like the first step we need to have a candidate for log-finite Coalgebra. But to prove this actual result is sort of like the largest fixed point, we still need some sort of like choice principles. And you can get around them in practice, like if you have, like in some instances you can like prove that you actually have access to these choice principles, but not in full generality. So yeah, I see there's a question coming up.
So choice implies excluded middle, is that right? Well, yeah.
Sure, I'm not quite sure. Don't put me on the spot.
Usually does. It usually does.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so that's like, so then you're
Well,
kind
that's the case in
Yeah.
HoTT theory, but sorry, elsewhere. So usually choice implies excluded middle, but I don't know if that proves to
Yes.
There's a proof in the hot book, but essentially you use the fact that if you have some proposition, you can form higher inductive type, where with 2 points and the path between them, if and only if that proposition holds. This is a set, so it maps into that split that you end up being able to decide the proposition. This is the classical proof, which is translated into something.
So the very last part is like pretty recent, we like haven't quite minimized that one yet. Like, I mean, what exactly the principle is that seems to be necessary, so it's a bit work in progress. But it seems to just require some sort of extra choice principle that you don't have like in a pure constructive setting. So what I learned doing this is that like, HoTT is actually kind of useful to do these sort of like calculations and you tend to like actually understand the proofs. People look at this sort of like, they often use these to like describe dynamical systems in some sense, like your favorite state machines. The type theorists use this sort of machinery to deal with data types. But it turns out I kind of like it. It makes me understand the proofs. The constructive approaches aren't necessarily more complicated. I mean, if you're seeing this for the first time, you probably won't believe me, but there is some beauty to like the simple definition using the fin sets. And well, yeah, coherence of appropriate reference. Like if you want to do constructive things, you better keep all of your knowledge around and don't just throw it away halfway through the proof and then try and recover it later. So yeah, that's about it. What I want to do in the next time is generalize the statement a bit, but also minimize this no-go theorem from earlier, because it doesn't actually depend on the multiset bundle directly. It already works with things that essentially generate unordered binary trees. So that would be kind of cool to see sort of like why exactly that fails. Cool, thank you. Yes.
Why did you want your nonsense to be finite?
The thing is, if you don't do that, then you might get some trouble with like proving the sort of like the limit exists. But I don't think it's inherently necessary. It's just that because sort of like where we started this work, it was kind of like the motivation was inherently finite multisets. But I don't think it's actually necessary to put the finite condition there.
I was thinking like if you have just sets instead of things that then you really have just a polynomial function.
Yes, so actually the proof that I'm using right now at one point depends on some sort of like finite choice principle. So that you can commute certain quotients or truncations with like finitely many times. There might be a way to get around that, but I don't know how that works. Maybe other people that are smarter than I am do know how that works, but and yes.
Maybe it's going to be a strict question. If I have a polynomial functor, I can just make the greatest fixed point by building a closure, right? But I guess you wanted to prove that it exists within Agda.
Yeah, right. So we kind of want to prove that it exists in Agda, and sort of, I'm not particularly convinced that sort of like the co-inductive types, as Agda does have them, and the higher inductive types really play well together. I'm not quite sure. Maybe I just don't know the literature well enough, but I'm not really sure whether this is like sort of like motivated by any models, like what that would even mean, because I mean, extra identifications in a co-injected data types sound like some sort of like body simulation business to me, but I'm not sure how to sort of like find these things in the cubicle set model. I don't know how to do that, but I would like to. Yes.
So is the idea? So you mentioned at the end that you want to generalize this to analytic factors. So I mean, most of this that you showed us didn't really, to me, like give a picture of how this will actually work. So are you going to try and sort of take the quotient that you take and sort of put it on the left?
Yes. Roughly that's the idea. But it's a very interesting discussion to be had, like what it even means for functor to like to be analytic, because I don't know, there's different definitions floating around in your standard category theory textbook, and most of them are just equivalent classically, but as always in sort of like a constructive settings, these things tend to splinter into like non-equivalent statements. So like even me saying, oh, I'll have a look at analytic functors is not quite a well-defined thing, because you first have to agree what exactly you mean. And I mean, this is why I like to put these things with like, you know, air quotes. Because yeah, this is classically obviously equivalent formulations, but constructively that's more difficult to model. Yeah.
So I assume you need to have some conditions on the quotient to actually make this work, right? I can probably think like of equivalence relations where this would completely break.
Yes. I mean, one of the more annoying parts is that sort of like some people define analytic functors as things that preserve certain kind of limits, and then that's just a statement of the theorem, which is like, okay, sure, that works, and it's convenient as some sort of like, I don't know, yeah, nice categorical property, but it's like, okay, well, you just define your theorem to be the definition, right? It's not really that useful. And sort of like having it in sort of like this presentation, like an analytic functor looks like something like this is a bit more hands down. And then you actually need to prove something. Yes?
So I just wondered if there's so you mentioned trees at the end, and I wondered if there's a connection with this paper by Tamo and Keiko and Mark Besum about infinite, walking through infinite trees with mixed induction and recursion. Sorry, mixed induction and co-induction, and they also talk about this lesser principle of omniscience and stuff. So.
Yes, probably. I haven't read that paper in particular, probably that, given that I work with Tamo. Yeah, probably. So there's, I mean, this is like a 30-minute presentation of, I don't know, about 10,000 lines of lacquer code. So there's more in the formalization, and we wrote something up with like more detail, and we related to other constructions. We have like 4 different equivalent versions of defined multisets. So, and at some point, talking about like recursive coalgebras and stuff like this comes in. So yeah, I figure there is a connection. Once I'm back, I'll just have a look there and see what this is about.
Okay, let's thank the speaker again.